Good morning, Penn State fans. It's the October 16th edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr from Blue White Illustrated. I'm Greg Pickle. Penn State 6-0, number 3 in the country, and in its second bye week of the offseason, or of the season rather. It's final of the season. T. Frank, we were at practice last night. A very short session, as we'll get into here in a few minutes. And then James Franklin talked with reporters after. The only time he'll do so during this Penn State bye week, but it's Wednesday. It's October 16th. Like I mentioned earlier, we're midway through the season. Part of what we're going to do today is talk about some midseason grades and what we've learned about Penn State and evaluate it watching Penn State over the last 6 weeks. But first of all, how are we feeling as Penn State gets ready for a night game trip to Wisconsin next week after this bye week?
I love double bye seasons. I could do this for the rest of my life with 2 byes in a season. It is unbelievable the amount of work you can get done to prepare for the next chunk of season. Like, I'm so excited later this week to get into Wisconsin before Wisconsin week, and then, watch some Ohio State and some Minnesota. And it's just been so nice to not be feel like I'm falling forward throughout the season. So I love this. I'm feeling great. I don't have the same level of I don't say it's panic, but just that sort of when you get that in that tunnel vision of you've got 1,000 things to do and you just have to hyper focus through everything. And then, so that I'm not experiencing this year, and I love it.
Yes, double bye week, good for us, good for Penn State as well. James Franklin, we'll talk about this here in a second here too, but said it was a good time for the bye after the win at USC. And certainly I think they felt like, T. Frank, before that first bye, that it was a little too early in the season. But then it turned out that they needed that time, not just for rest and recovery, but also a little bit of a reboot after the first 2 weeks. But this one comes, I think, at an even better time. Penn State, of course, is coming off the trip to USC and had to adjust. I think it'd be really difficult to play another game at home or on the road after that trip to USC, even though they did fly back into State College on Saturday after the game. So certainly that's a big help for the Nittany Lions as they, again, look toward the second half of the season. So let's get into the Penn State practice report, T. Frank. Not a whole lot to cover here. It was a very, I would say, fundamental focused practice is probably the best way to put it. And the Nittany Lions were not on the field for long, or at least it's not as long as they usually are during the regular season. But James Franklin, talking with us afterwards, called it a really good session, which I think is all you can ask for at this point.
Yeah, I think the way I phrase it is they're taking a mental and physical break this week because they need it at this point in the season where they've had these bumps and bruises we've talked about, and we'll get into some of that in the positional grading. But they've kind of had, despite having 2 bye weeks, the first one I think was more intense from what we saw in practice that Wednesday, a little more good on good. And then even, when we were leaving, you mentioned they were doing a short practice. I don't think it was anything intense from a physical standpoint. It was more mental work of what they wanted to improve. And James Franklin talked about that, of things that they needed to improve for the second half of the season. They could really dig into those mental details. And that's really, I think, as you mentioned, setting them up well, not only coming off that emotional win cross country from USC, but also now you get this, if I feel that way about having time to prepare for the second half of the season, how do you think the coaching staff feels when they've got not only do they have more analysts in the program now, but they have more time specifically to dive into things and do self-scouting, self-evaluation, some of the things we talked about yesterday. So I think that particular aspect of practice was good for them. It wasn't good for us though, Greg, because as you mentioned, fundamental, I was seeing things that they do with prospects in camp over the summer in terms of they were back to basic fundamentals yesterday while we were there.
Yeah, and certainly it's a good time to reemphasize those things one final time before they get into Wisconsin game prep. A couple things from the chat to get to. Thanks, as always, for everyone that shows up, whether you're new, whether you're a recurring guest. We appreciate you being here with us. Question: Stephen mentions the early weather report in Wisconsin. It's going to change 50 times, Stephen, as you well know, between now and then. So we'll get a better feel for that next week. But I'll be completely honest with you. I don't like looking at the weather this far out at any point. I'm not even going to like looking at it during next Wednesday's show, because while it's going to be certainly closer to kickoff, I don't know. We've seen so much change in the days leading up to games this season.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that until Friday you really have a good feel for it. David says, thanks for helping me get through the week, guys. You're welcome. Thanks for being here with us. Don't forget, coming up later in the week, we'll have the recruiting show on Thursday and a wrestling show as well. Greg asked, chances we get Aller and some other surprise 2022 class players back for next season. Let's get through this season first. Greg, I understand the question for sure. And certainly that'll be a big part of the next season for Penn State, but it's just way too early to have that conversation.
That kind of answers itself as they play. So I think you'll get my sense of how I feel about some of these players, Greg, in our conversation. Both Gregs will get my sense of how these players have played so far and their chances of staying or going based on, the grades we give out here in just a few minutes. So not to be determined, but also, yes, to be determined, but also will to be told here in a second.
Yeah, a couple other questions in the chat. We'll get to those guys when we get to the position group you're referencing in the grades that we're going to get into. But first, let's cover what James Franklin had to say, T. Frank. And I was a little late here, so do we have any? We don't have any clips of him today,
no.
So we're just going to straight recap that. There really was not a whole lot to dive into. Yes, that's correct. No doubt about that. Not a whole lot to dive into from James Franklin's news conference last night. He said that they're hoping to get Kaden, Saunders, and Jake Spencer. I didn't know Jake Spencer was hurt. He was, of course, a walk-on who's returned one punt this season. But they're hoping to get both of those guys back in the return game. He thinks the punt return with Zion Tracy is solid. Obviously, they're just not getting a lot of explosives in either return area. So that was a conversation last night. Keon Wiley is someone they're hoping to get back at some point. Those were really the three big news nuggets. Go ahead, T. Frank.
Yeah, so the Keon Wiley thing, I think, is you're hoping to get anybody back at any point, right? And so, I think that there's a little bit of, we're hoping to get him back. What's the reality of that? And again, we have seen this happen before with Zariah Fisher, but at the same time, you don't want to count on the outliers in these situations. The part about Kaden Saunders I have a hard time with because he was not healthy before we saw him in a boot. We have photos of him in a boot. So let's do just a little bit of speculation that it's a similar or the same injury re-aggravated. Greg, are you expecting, even if he plays, anything more than what we've seen with Kaden Saunders so far this year?
Yeah, it's interesting because he was one of the guys I sought out back at Media Day in August to talk to him about the fact that he had a chance, based on what Justin Lustig told us hours earlier at Penn State Media Day, that he was a leader in the clubhouse for the punt return job. And that he had a chance to regain the job. He had, of course, lost last season to Daquan Hardy. And he was adamant that he could do some of the things explosion-wise we saw Daquan Hardy do. And we just hadn't seen that this year when he was back there because of the issue he's been dealing with. And it's obviously pretty clear that popped up after he spoke with us before the second practice of training camp.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would be hesitant to put too much stock into the idea that if he does come back, he will be able to be more explosive. Again, without knowing what he had done. And I think the other thing that's important to remember too, in a general sense, as we talk about these injury situations and long-term this and short-term that, and we hope to get guys back, it is no longer you hope to get them back for the end of the regular season. You could also be, you have not a whole month, but pretty close to it until you would play a first-round playoff game. And then if you would get a bye, you do have a full month between the end of the regular season.
Almost like the conversation with a bowl game.
Right. So, I think we have to be careful, and I know this was on the Lions Den message board yesterday about, the question was focused on KJ Winston and whether he could come back. And, when you hear James Franklin say we're hoping to get guys back, that does not necessarily mean by the end of the regular season. That could be hopeful for the first round of the playoffs. That could be hopeful for the quarterfinals, regardless of the bye situation or not.
Yeah.
So to me, I just think it's important to keep that in mind when you hear these things. Some guys may be able to come back just in general. Could come back before the end of the regular season. Others, you're looking at more along the lines of the playoff.
Yeah, and that seems to be part of the conversation with Penn State football this year is there is an expectation of making the playoff. It is not James Franklin has been less 1-0 this year, Greg. I think just generally talking about big games, playing your best in big games, all the way back to the spring, talking about a potential 17-game season. All of these, if we had Nate Bauer here, he would tell us the difference between the language that Franklin is using, but just somebody who is not a James Franklin expert, he would not, there was a firewall up between conversation about any sort of speculation of the future and the task at hand.
Right.
It's not the same way anymore. So I think that these conversations are interesting and valid, and also now have a different flavor to them that they did previously within the discourse of Penn State football, as opposed to, like, people talk about this stuff all the time, national media, fans, all that stuff. But like the day-to-day, you and I talking to them about this, there is this longer lens when it comes to all these conversations.
Yeah, and that's been the case really all year long, but certainly the start of the season. So if you go through, let's just use James Franklin's social media as an example. Like, they have the 1-0 cam, they have, he tweets about 1-0, things like that. But he no longer does the, Monday
West Virginia.
Sunday of game week. Yeah. Well, you get to West Virginia, but you no longer have the 1-0. So it's a little bit of a different vibe there, and which is interesting. I'm trying to find USC one, and I'm struggling to do so. This is why, it's game week. Let's do this together, Nittany Nation. We need everyone, students, faculty, lettermen, alumni, and fans worldwide locked in on being 1-0 against USC Saturday. So he did use it this week. Has not been an every week thing like it has been in the past, and also the opponent tweets are going to. So certainly a different tone this year. There's no question about that.
Yeah. Do you think that's because he was less confident about the USC game traveling across the country, so he was trying to get into the universe for all the good vibes against USC?
No, because it's been a slightly different but somewhat similar version of that each week so far.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I think he definitely has a different tone though. I think you hit the nail right on the head. He has been willing so far to take on a longer outlook in terms of his interviews and things like that. Now, again, he was asked last night about rankings and college football playoff and things like that, and he quickly made note that we don't talk. Penn State does not talk about those things. 1-0, blah blah blah. So that is, certainly still the case. But definitely a little bit more willing to look ahead and compared to years past this year.
Yeah, for sure.
So, all right. Well, I believe it's an ad break time, T. Frank. Is that right? Do I get to do that this week?
Well, this one is perfect for you if you want to do it.
I will. I would love to. All right. So we're so happy to have Labatt with us as a sponsor here on the BWI Live Show. We're going to do this live, T. Franks. Let's see how it goes. When it's time to kick back and watch the game, grab a Pilsner. That's as pristine as Happy Valley itself. Labatt Blue and Blue Light deliver an unmatched taste that goes down smooth every time. I was joking with Fitz yesterday. I don't know if you're allowed to break these things off and continue then, but
sure.
I was joking with Fitz yesterday that he needs product placement when he's on the post-game show. He needs a Labatt, so we're going to work on that. He then asked if I was going to have one on the Wednesday show, and I said not at 10 o'clock in the morning. Maybe during a bye week it would have been acceptable, but well, maybe in the post after the season we'll do that. But
there you go.
At any rate, whether you're tailgating before a noon game at 10 a.m. or listening to us on the BWI Live Show, at the game with 107,000 of your closest friends, or just watching on the couch, Labatt and Labatt Blue Light are your go-to for unbeatable drinkability. When you're watching Penn State, the BWI Live Show, or whatever you're doing to follow the Nittany Lions, bleed blue and white, drink blue and light. You can find Labatt products at Stan's Beverage Distribution, 75 Ashland Avenue in Carlisle. Please drink responsibly. Labatt USA, Buffalo, New York.
Super excited to have them here. They're our post-game show sponsor, and we were so excited to have them here. I wanted to involve them this week. Obviously, it's a bye week, so here we are on the Wednesday show. This is not the post-game show, but always happy to have Labatt here with us. As I said before, Buffalo, New York, you could not get closer to T. Frank's heart and homeland than a Labatt. So appreciate having them here. Let's get to our midseason Greg's grades. Greg and his grades here on the show.
Yes. All right. Let's get into it. I'm assuming we have some kind of a graphic for that, T. Frank, but I
just roll into the quarterbacks.
All right. Let's do it. So, as we said earlier in the show, a lot of today's discussion is going to be centered on grading each position group. Play along with us in the comments. We'll share some as we roll along here. But let's start with the quarterbacks, T. Frank. Penn State is in the second year of Drew Aller's tenure as the starting quarterback for Penn State. There's, of course, a Bo Prabula package, and Andy Kotelnicki, Danny O'Brien, and Drew Aller have certainly taken large steps forward this year. I go with a B plus, or for the quarterbacks at this point of the season. You have an A minus.
Yeah.
So why do I have a B plus and you have an A minus? I think I know where you're at. I think an A minus is completely fair to me. The two turnovers against USC were slightly concerning. Didn't cost Penn State the game, and Drew Aller was at his best in the fourth quarter when he needed to be. But those were a little bit concerning. There were some times earlier in the year where we saw some 2023 Drew Aller in
Yep.
terms of a little bit happy in the pocket and things like that. So I settled on a B plus, but I think an A- is completely fair.
Yeah. So I don't necessarily. This is going to sound harsh. I'm not considering anybody other than Drew Aller when I give
Right.
this grade. Bo Prabula coming in, Tyler Warren taking snaps under center. That's all great, but the offense and its health runs through the starting quarterback, Drew Aller.
Right.
And you said it right there in your kind of summation. There have been a couple of moments of 2023 Drew Aller throughout the season. It was not a perfect turn the page to the new guy, but we've seen more of that than we have 2023 Drew Aller. And to me, this is also about what did you need to do this offseason? What did you need to beat? I don't even care about those interceptions because they were within his personality. The defense made some good plays. I want him confident and slinging the football. And you can't get more confident than anticipation throwing, barely looking at your backside read, knowing exactly where that's going to be. That guy was exactly where you expected him to be, but the problem was there was a defender there that you weren't expecting. In the second interception, they did have a bit of a disguise on that coverage where they showed him one thing pre-snap and it came back something else. But overall, he's very good at reading defenses, anticipating the coverage, and throwing to the open receiver. And again, kind of getting into my film analysis of what he did against USC, despite those interceptions, he didn't waver. James Franklin talked about a postgame. He grinded through the mistakes. It didn't go perfectly for him, but he didn't fold. He flushed the bad plays, and he came back demonstrative on the sideline, a guy who fired up his own team. Even down to like the snap issue with Juice. I keep wanting to call him Juice Scruggs for some reason. With Nick Dawkins. Dawkins didn't hear him. The snap, the play clock was getting low, and Aller was freaking out to get the football.
Yes, he
like
was.
That
but
level
but then he composed himself very quickly.
But that level of demand, right? So you see NFL quarterbacks, and I don't think that everyone needs to be a terrible person to be a great quarterback, but you need to have a level of expectation that Drew Aller has for himself. He has now been more demonstrative about that from his teammates in the way he's operated the offense. He doesn't have to scream at people on the sideline, but when it comes to making mistakes and clear displeasure about that, it's not rolling off his back. So from a leadership perspective, from a performance perspective, he's playing like a first-round quarterback. It has not been perfect. There have been times I have seen some throws he can make that I think are NFL level throws, and that's my barometer for him is like, did he make all the NFL level throws in a game? Because he's capable of that. So I come back with an A-, and that is a very positive, like this is the most positive grade you can have, even though it's not the highest grade I gave out.
Yeah, no question about that. I think the key, and you sort of just hit the nail on the head, is that you're seeing Drew Aller be a guy who is living what he talked about during the offseason, which is being able to flush the bad plays, not let them bring him down, bring the offense down, and instead, bouncing back, which is, again, just something that was not the case a year ago. So a lot of positive signs for him and this Penn State quarterback room so far this season. Let's move on to the running backs. And there was a question in the chat, how's Nick Singleton looking? He was good. He was back at practice when we were there yesterday.
Yep.
All seems to be fine there. I know he didn't look 100% when Penn State beat USC. But anyway, I give the Lions a B. You give them a B-, so we're in the same ballpark as each other again. To me, I think that skip to that. Well, the chat, the question about the tight end, I think that just popped up about the tight ends. Is it true? We'll spend little time on that. But as for the running backs, it's been certainly a different Penn State rushing attack without Nick Singleton against UCLA. Yeah. And then, of course, against USC. I mean, there was a lot of questions about did he play? Was he playing? He was on the field quite a bit. And he did carry 10 times, only 26 yards. Katron Allen, 16 for 56. Yeah. Penn State averaged 3.8 yards per carry. And those numbers, Singleton and Allen both carried for lower average than Aller and, of course, Tyler Warren. He only rushed once. But, I think that the key, T. Frank, is that these guys are doing what you need them to do. Nick Singleton catches the game-tying touchdown pass. Yep. They're not putting the ball on the ground, so on and so forth. But certainly I think you have to, when making this grade, you have to you have to pair, I guess, the first 4 games with the last 2.
So that's probably fair. And I went back and forth on this grade because I changed it from, I think you and I had the same grade of like a B to changing it to a B-. And part of it is reactionary to the last 2 games. And it's more about Katron Allen and his performance this year. He's been better than the stats indicate, but at the same time, as Jay says here in the chat, the running backs don't make many miss. Nick Singleton was doing that early in the season. I think the injury has changed that a little bit. And so to me, that is explanatory. And this is the problem, right? Of like, how do you factor injuries into your evaluation of a team or player or a position? But given the opportunity, there were a couple of times during that USC game, Katron Allen had the opportunity to break a tackle against a cornerback and get an explosive play, and he gets the yards that are there. He gets 9 yards. Andy Kotelnicki schemed 9 yards for him. He needed to make one player miss. That guy, he falls forward for, I think, a first down or 9 yards or something like that. Nick Singleton has been a complete back so far this year. It's just the injury and the lack of the big plays recently. I think those two things are tied together. So it's a little unfair, but I am giving a B- because I do think there are times where this group, and if we again, this is about expectation, what we expected of this group as opposed to where they're performing. And I think generally it's a little bit under, and that's probably why I'm too harsh here. I even think I'm too harsh giving a B-. I'm already apologizing for what I did.
That's the fun of doing the report card either after a game or at the midseason mark like this. The fun of it is that it's like I always find myself in this situation where I talk myself in and out of like 3 different grades and then feel it necessary to explain all 3 of them. KJ Johnson 77, BWI midseason grade is A+. Thanks so much, and thank you for the super chat donation. You are A+ in our book as well. Let's move on to the tight ends. Why not? I'm sorry, not the tight ends, the wide receivers. Everyone's favorite conversation. The Penn State wide receivers, the Nittany Lions, win this season with question marks at that spot. At this point, I went with a C-. You went with a B-. I think, I had a C+. Either way, that's all good. C-, C+. It's all the same. That's okay. But
C- to me, did seem harsh. I was thinking like we weren't too far off on a lot of these. So yeah.
Yes.
Anytime that there's a lot of graphics, it's always a great opportunity to see exactly how good my proofreading skills are, which is and always will be abysmal. I proofread all of these, and still, I knew we were coming across one of them at some point today.
Yeah, all good. So yeah, I had a C+, and I think a B- is fair too. If these guys, and I have a series at Blue White Illustrated, both for the magazine and for the website, that kind of breaks these down in written form. But the thing to me, T. Frank, is that if these guys build on the performance at USC, they will have every chance to have a higher grade at the end of the season. But we need to see it more consistently. At some point, someone's going to do what USC and mostly everybody else on the schedule has failed to do, and that is just to say Tyler Warren is not beating us. And when
that was Illinois' plan, right? Yeah.
Right. And when that happens, can these guys make enough plays to replace what Penn State would not be getting from Tyler Warren? So that's the question to me. I can't answer that with a ton of confidence at this point. I would say I have more confidence in that being the case after last week than if you would have asked me 2 weeks ago. Because I really think they had a nice game, even though the stat sheet was not crazy. And obviously when one guy catches 17 passes, it's going to be tough for anybody else to have huge numbers in the receiving game. But that would be the big question to me. Julian Fleming, 2 big catches that I don't know if Penn State has a guy last year that makes those catches on 4th down. He gets open to make those catches, let alone making the catch.
No, they had multiple opportunities, that exact play several times last year. But even during the bowl game, I watched them throw that route and not make that play. So that's why he's here. That is exactly the moment and the play he was brought here to make.
Yeah, David makes, as he says, wide receivers came up big against USC. They certainly did. I mean, there's no question that group really had a great game. And even like I was watching from the press box, obviously, some of the plays that, Maury Evans catch, Trey Wallace's catch, like those guys got themselves open. I mean, the USC has some pretty decent defensive backs that, those guys made an emphasis to try and, stop Penn State from making plays down the field in the passing game. And they found ways to get open and then make the catch. And again, that's just something that if we continue to see that, and Drew Aller keeps delivering passes like he did in the second half, pretty much right on the money, this is going to be a much higher grade for these guys at the end of the year than it is maybe right now.
Yeah, and talking about expectation and some of the, like, what did you want to see from a progress standpoint from these players? Amari Evans has been better through contact. He's been better at getting open when guys are aggressive with him throughout the route. He has not been perfect, and he has not been like a transformative player in that particular sense. But again, like you said, making a play in single coverage along the sideline to set up a touchdown, that was a huge play. Julian Fleming is not a number one wide receiver coming in here to soak up all the targets and all. Like I made the joke sort of before the season that he is a possession receiver that is a good but not great athlete. But Tyler Warren is an elite tight end. The margin there of their two skill sets overlap. But you've got two of those guys on the field who I think are doing very good jobs. And it always sounds disrespectful. I don't mean it to be that. He's doing exactly what he needs to. And so then you talk about Trey Wallace as the number one wide receiver. He's had some drops. I think he's had some frustration issues with some of the body language I've seen from him after not getting targets. I think maybe that's affected him a little bit at times. But again, a guy who is, when you needed him, he made plays. So a couple of drops, couple of big plays, in that USC game, or the deep pass in the Bowling Green game where he didn't go up and get the football. Those are the areas I'm looking at where I'm like, there's still progress to be made. And I do think Trey Wallace has the potential at all times to be a number one wide receiver. He's still working through that, I think. And that's where, from a B to a B plus, the quarterback distributing the ball the way he does and emphasizing different players in different games, I think has been good overall for this group. But it does kind of speak to, there is no number one wide receiver right now. And there are still players who are getting better instead of kind of reaching their peak, as you might say, what we get in the next particular group of players.
Right. Yep. No, I completely agree. And they're also doing a nice job in the run game as blockers, which was not always the case.
Great point.
A year ago either. So, I know that some fans are probably still frustrated with Marcus Hagans and, have opinions about this receivers room. To me, I think it's not negatively impacting this team, and it's probably a little bit better than I thought it was going to be.
Yeah.
And again, with the, with recency bias being the case, because in my opinion, they just played their best game of the season. I'm throwing out Kent State and everything that happened in that game.
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm at with it. All right. Stephen Light, a super chat and great season of coverage from the BWI team. Thank you, and thanks for being with us here on the BWI YouTube channel and also over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. It's a good time to remind you, please like and subscribe here on the YouTube channel or the podcast feed if you're listening. We really appreciate that. It helps us out a lot. I know you hear that on every single podcast and think to yourself probably, well, how does it help them out? It does. Just trust us. It does. So please,
we don't know how,
and subscribe. Right.
But it does. That's let me Greg, nobody cares about this, but like the algorithm, the almighty algorithm, right? That I always joke about. If you subscribe, then it goes, okay, people like this enough that they subscribe to it. So we're going to put it in front of other people who have never seen it before. So you don't even have to share with your friends. If you subscribe and just like you watch this show every week, or you listen to our videos and our cutouts of the show and you subscribe, that you're already helping to share with your friends because of how all these things work. At least that's how my understanding of it.
Right. Nope. You hit the nail right on the head. So thank you, everyone, for being here with us. Let's get to our last one on offense, T. Frank. That is, of course, tight ends. I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on the tight ends because I think we all know Tyler Warren is one of the best, most impactful players in college football. I think he won every national award that possibly existed this week after his big day against USC. Terrific player. Andy Kolnicki gets all the credit in the world for finding ways to use him in creative situations that help him make an impact even when teams are trying to take him away. I genuinely don't understand how USC failed to cover him over and over and over again, but they did.
You can find out at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com.
You certainly can, yes. And so check out T. Frank's film study over there. But yeah, and I guess the one thing that's interesting to me about this position, just to not belabor the point, but we have seen over the last few years, Penn State have a number of tight ends contribute, and Khalil Dinkins and Luke Reynolds are playing a fine number of snaps, I guess you could say. But certainly, unlike years past, this is a one-man show, and Tyler Warren is the starring attraction.
Yeah, but this is obviously an A+ from both of us. I guess the thing that backs it up is that I think Khalil Dinkins has been better than I expected in the run game. I know that I focused on him specifically as a receiver before the season, and James Franklin said like he's a guy you can't put in that bucket of a guy who just is a receiver because he blocks well. And I'd seen no evidence of it. I took James Franklin at his word that he believed that, and then Khalil Dinkins has backed up that and more in my estimation of his skills, that he's been a really good run blocker. Part of that is when he's getting into these double teams, Anthony Donko is ridiculously good. So he's being, there is a little bit of help from the fact that the offensive line in certain areas has had some elite performance, and he's benefiting off of that. But even in one-on-one situations or against linebackers, he's been really good. So it's not just that Tyler Warren is the star of the show, because he is, but it's also about then the supporting cast is doing what they need to do in their roles. Even down to Luke Reynolds, who is playing like a freshman, making some physical and mental mistakes, but at the same time is not hurting the team in any dramatic way. He's a better run blocker than I anticipated in this situation. And it's just that he's 249 pounds and a true freshman, and not a 255 pounder where we eventually think he'll be as far as his overall skill level, size, all those things. He is so early in his development. He's ahead of schedule. So all of these things also back up that this is an A+ group for sure.
Yeah, forced into action, of course, because of the injury to Andrew Rapplier that is long-term. And certainly, I think even though they had to kind of rush him to the field quicker than expected, he's doing quite well. All right, let's wrap up the offense with the offensive line, T. Frank.
Yep.
I believe we are in lockstep here. We both handed out a grade of B+ for this group. And I really went back and forth on this. I started with an A-, and then I went down to a B, and then I just cut the difference and landed at a B+. I think it's done a lot of good things. Penn State is very good statistically speaking when it comes to not allowing sacks. I think it's 6 on the year maybe, and not allowing tackles for loss. Those are 2 positive stats for the Nittany Lions, and I think the best thing you can say about it is 3 new starters, even though Donko and Drew Shelton played and have started in the past in terms of being the guy for a full season. 3 new starters, including, of course, Nick Dawkins at center. And we've not spent a lot of time talking about these guys, which is pretty much the biggest compliment you can offer any offensive line at any point in time.
Yeah, they were rolling as a run blocking group before Anthony Donko got hurt. And I think the sheer fact that they had a guy like Nolan Rucci on the roster to come in and play a similar level is really impressive to the that speaks to the depth they have too, that you have guys like Cooper Cousins that can come in, so you can move Venga Ioane and move him around the formation and make him a star offensive lineman if those things are possible from a guard, not only a tackle. We're going to get to the D-line, and we're going to split those into defensive tackle and defensive end. If I had to split hairs here, the offensive tackles haven't been quite as good overall as the interior, because I think Sal Wormley and Venga Ioane have been really good on the interior. Last week wasn't Sal's best game, but overall I think the interior, providing Aller that stable pocket in front of him, has been a difference maker for him to start the year, with that confidence that he can maneuver through things. And not to bring up Aller again, but when he hasn't had that, he still maneuvered through it really well, like at that 4th down play where he throws to Fleming. So this group has been not only good, but resilient. And so I think that gives them, from what might have been a B grade with some leaky protection on the outside at points this year, and maybe some development hitches from some of the guys, I think overall they have done what they need to do, and that is open up holes and protect for the quarterback. So yeah, B+ is a really good grade for an aggregate, right? So there's 5 players that we're trying to evaluate here that are 2 different positions, 3 different positions. So a B+ is a pretty easy way to just kind of cut down the middle.
You are listening to the October 16th edition of BWI Live. That's Thomas Frank Carr. I'm Greg Pickle. We are from BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, as we get ready to head into our defensive grades, just want to hit on a couple of things from the chat. I'm going to have to do some scrolling here, so stick with me. This one about Tom Allen's a good segue to the defense. Indiana doing so well after Tom Allen left does not make him look good. Yeah, I guess. They have a lot of different players than when Tom Allen was there. Kirk Cignetti brought plenty of guys with him. Yeah, you can say they're JMU guys, but they know his system inside and out. And I think that ultimately, I definitely get it, and it's not the best look in the world. I'm just not sure it's as bad as maybe some might make it out to be. But this is the one I want to spend a little bit more time on from JC. Time for a healthy challenge. Are we being fooled given that the combined record of PSU's first 6 opponents is 14-22? Your thoughts, T. Frank?
I don't know. You have to play the players and the teams that are on your schedule. I think if you watch that USC game and you said that's not a good team because they're 3-3, that's not fair to the situation and how Penn State played in that game. Penn State didn't play well. Like, let's be clear, they did not play a complete game. James Franklin said that after the game, but they did fight through adversity, not play their best, and come out on top. And so the markers of progress are there for this team in the areas they needed to get better. And I also think that they have done a lot of things this year to set themselves up for success later on instead of trying to run up the score on Kent State. And I felt like that game was a warm up for Illinois. Like they did a lot of things in that game to introduce new concepts and to introduce some things they want to do on defense. So it is what it is, which is to say, I don't know, JC. That's a fair point, but we're always going to have this conversation, Greg, because they haven't played Ohio State yet, so nobody cares. Like there's a certain element of, it doesn't matter until you get to the most important games, but you have to win the games along the way for those important games to matter. Ask USC. They did not do that. So you have to get, I don't know. Greg, what do you think? Save me here.
Yeah, so a couple thoughts. So ESPN's Football Power Index ranks Penn State's strength of schedule to date at number 52. It ranks its remaining strength of schedule at number 24. So to your point, some tougher tests are coming, and I think Team Rankings has Penn State's strength of schedule as so far at number 25. I mean, look, you're right. You hit the nail right on the head. You have to beat who's in front of you. Penn State has done that. Has it always done it in a pretty fashion? Absolutely not. Could that catch up to it eventually? Yes. But, I would say this, and I think if you go back and listen to the last Wednesday show, I think this is where I said it. Maybe it was on the post-game video after the UCLA game. But either way, I really thought that if Penn State started slow at USC, it would have no chance of winning. And guess what? That happened, and it won. So I give this team a lot of credit for that. Is it the number 3 team in the country? That is something that's been debated all week and will continue to be. But all told, do I think that anyone following this team is being fooled by the fact that they're 6-0 and that they're number 3 and that maybe they're not as good as many think they are? I just feel like when you go on the road to USC and you don't play your best and you still win, that says a lot more to me than the fact that your first 6 opponents were 14 and 22.
Yeah, and they've won decisively in all of these games. From a perspective of, was the final score, did they put together a full 4-quarter performance? They have not done that, but they have done things throughout each game. Kind of going back to what you said about the offense, they found a way to win different ways in different games so far this season. So those are things where I look at that and I go, if they need to get into a shootout, they've got a good opportunity to win because the quarterback and the receivers are getting better and playing better together. The running game has been explosive this year, and we expect that to rebound once Nick Singleton's foot or whatever is wrong with him, whatever lower body injury or whatever injury it was, gets a little bit better. So I see the markers of they can adapt and play better. And, West Virginia was a good team until they weren't. I think we thought, they weren't as good as the preseason hype for them was internally. But they still, are not a bad team. So yeah, I'm talking in circles at this point, so just cut me off. Turn off my mic.
No, and Jarrett makes a nice point too. I would if I could. I don't think I have that ability, but take away the 6 wins and it's 14 and 16. But the second part of his comment is the key here. Kent State is terrible. They probably are gonna go winless. I don't know. I mean, they might have one win on their schedule somewhere, but that stat is always going to be skewed by Kent State, and that just is what it is. As James Franklin said the week that Penn State played them, Frank, you cannot necessarily project, how teams are going to be when you schedule them 4, 5, 6 years out, whatever it may be. So I think it's important to keep that in mind as well, that any of those strength of schedule, things like that, could be dragged down by Kent State's just horrendous stats. And so I'm assuming it's only gotten worse since they played Penn State, not better.
So this is the problem. JC, he knew the answer to the question when he asked it. He seems like he's a lawyer or someone who litigates, because he says, West Virginia's 3 losses are to teams that are combined 18-0. Yeah, that's my problem answering this question is I don't do follow-up analysis and autopsies on West Virginia and Illinois. I know Illinois won 50-49, but I haven't been paying attention to their season overall. So that's that's the context I'm missing to say, were these teams good against other competition? Because I think they were fair challenges to Penn State that Penn State bested easily, but I'm not paying attention to the rest of their schedule, which is what this conversation in the context absolutely needs. That I don't think either of us have the time to go into all those details.
Yeah, so certainly at this point, I would say that Penn State, if you want to, look at it as, maybe fool's gold a little bit, I guess I would understand it, but to me, I think that, you can accept where Penn State is and think it is a top 10 team. If you want to argue it being number 3 at this point, I get it. But certainly a team
It's a
worthy
playoff
at
team.
this moment in time of making the playoff, hosting a game, and potentially getting a bye. So, all right, let's get into the second half of our show, grades analysis. I just clicked the button, and I'm not sure what I have going on here, but we're going to start with the defensive ends. I feel like this could be a time to make the comment section mad on the online. We'll have to wait and see here. Penn State, of course, moved Abdul Carter to defensive end to pair him with Denai Dennis Sutton and others this season. You give Penn State a grade of A- at defensive end. I do as well. I don't want to see any comments. I know they're coming, though, about moving Abdul Carter back to linebacker. It's not going to happen. It should not happen. And ultimately, I think he's playing very well there. I think Denai Dennis Sutton's playing quite well. And, are they getting as much production from the rest of the defensive ends as I would have thought? No, maybe not. But I think those guys are holding baseline at worst and aren't really impacting the game in most instances in a negative way.
Yeah, and they are. The problem is there's two ways of grading this. How are they playing? Raw production stats, output, end of story, which is how some people are going to say they're not playing well. And then there's the conversation about expectation. And that's where I think you and I and people, I've followed Denai Dennis Sutton since his junior year at McDonough. So I've had this long view of what I expect from him. And he is what I expected from him all the way back when he was a 5-star prospect. And I was talking to somebody about this, and I've said this before, but the reason I do high school evaluations and I help out on that side with Fitz and with Ryan is to hopefully set a baseline of expectation of what a player's skills are. Not just they're a 5-star, not just they're a 4-star, but what do they do, good and bad, because there are no perfect players. And where are the potential areas where they may struggle to live up to that, or they may exceed those expectations? Denai Dennis Sutton was a 5-star defensive end. Yes, he is a power player. He is a physical player, but he plays tall. And so he's been all of those things. He has been a physical, dominant run defender who at sometimes you can take advantage of athleticism laterally. And he is not Chop Robinson, so he's not going to get speed, immediate, quick wins, but he gets dominant wins with his hands and with power. Abdul Carter, I actually probably had lower expectations than everybody else because transitioning to defensive end is hard. James Franklin has talked about that the whole time, and his comments early were Abdul is exceeding our expectations. Abdul is exceeding my expectations from an awareness standpoint, from the little things that fans either don't know about because they're hard to see. Like if you're just following the ball, you might miss guys making plays that set up other players. And then there are things he's doing from an awareness standpoint I was not expecting from him in the run game and all those things. So stats and sacks are one thing, and then the holistic view of what they are and what you expect, they are either meeting or exceeding my expectations, which is why they get an A-, because they're not exceeding to the point of superstardom at this point of just, Penn State sees a lot of quick pressure or quick throws, and the nature of the defense makes teams antsy to begin with, and they're not blowing everything away and still getting sacks, which is what I think fans were expecting is the results, no matter what, from a pair of guys who have all of this superstar juice behind them.
Yeah, no question about it. Rob says there's not a stat to qualify wrecking havoc, but Carter is doing it. Yeah, so there is. The Action Network puts out weekly havoc rankings, and I think there's probably other places that do it too, but I just happen to have theirs up right now. Penn State number 6 in that category on defense right now. So certainly, again, I think you have to separate, and we might as well just get into defensive tackles here as this conversation continues and just put them together because I know that I can see the comments section lighting up already. But midseason grades for the defensive tackles, obviously starring Zane Durant. You have a B-, I have a B. I think that, this defensive line, I just think if you're looking just at the stat sheet, yes, you're going to say this group is not producing enough. It's not playing to the level that it did last year and not maybe where people expected it to. But the stats not being there and them not playing well are not – they don't go hand in hand. To me, you can see these guys creating pressure, especially in late in games, especially when it's go time. And does that lead to a sack? No. But if there was an easier way to track throwaways, and there's just not really a good way to do it, and quarterback hurries are, in my opinion, one of the worst kept stats. PFF does a pretty nice job, but other than that, like if you're looking at Penn State stats or ESPN.com stats or whatever, I think they're one of the worst track stats that there are. But if there was an easier way to track those and track throwaways and things like that, I think Penn State fans would have a much different level of appreciation for this defensive line. But if you're just looking at sacks and tackles for loss, I get it. You might not be impressed.
So and I'll get to the defensive. I'm getting caught up in the chat, so I want to circle back to something David says here. David Demkowski says, Dennis Sutton has publicly said his goal is to be the best defensive end in the country. He is not close to that. David, I said publicly when I was a teenager, I wanted to be 6'1" and have abs. And sometimes things are outside our control. Denai wants to be the best defensive end in the country. He's doing the things necessary to do that. But does he have the skill set to do that? It's my point, is that like his evaluation, he's going to be a very good defensive end. Did he have the composite skills to be the number 1 overall pick in the country, in the NFL draft, whenever that time comes? If everything worked out and he were to change some things about his abilities, maybe. Nick Bosa ran a 4.8 and was the number 2 overall pick. And that was my comp for a guy who had power and speed, but also had bend and ability, who could do those things. Denai has developed in a different way. And so, yes, coaches want to go undefeated and win national championships and never give up a point and score 60 points a game. Everyone's goals are usually different than reality. And so I guess that's my point. And then, to the defensive tackles. This is the one group I would say I'm more disappointed in their performance. Zane Durant, A+, set him aside. I have been very few times have I seen him even lose a rep, let alone the wins and the immediate wins and his impact on a game. But if there's a part of the starts slow conversation, the Penn State defensive tackles are squarely in my evaluation crosshairs of these guys play better in the second half of games. And I see things that I don't necessarily like from their technique standpoint, which I don't know if that's a coaching difference from last year, but their ability to switch gaps and create disruption up front, they've been blocked more than in previous years. Zane Durant aside, I would say that that's more reflective of where I am on that grade with the defensive tackles. He's been great, and that makes it all better. But there are times when I look at the other guys on that group and expecting a step forward from some guys and actually maybe a slight step back from players who played well last year.
All right, let's move on to the linebackers. T. Frank, Penn State obviously moved Abdul Carter to defensive end, as we noted earlier, which made things look different at this linebacker position. I went with a B-. You went with a B-. So go ahead and explain why you feel that way as Penn State gets ready for the second half. Been an interesting year for this group. You have Dom DeLuca currently playing with a soft cast, I guess you would call it, on his thumb injured. Tony Rojas was banged up early in the year, and if you told me he was dealing with an injury still, it would not surprise me just based on what we've seen with him from a tackling perspective. And so, I think Kobe King is maybe not getting as much credit as he should. It's a guy who sort of corrals this defense and takes those calls from Dan Connor and things like that. But overall, I just feel B- is fair. I really do.
Yeah, and so some of the defensive communication issues we talked about early in the year, which Penn State seems to have ironed out, I think affected this group, and Kobe King specifically, as you might expect, more than the rest of the defense. I'm also wondering, and this is something I got to do a little bit more diving into, of changing the philosophical approach of the defense, where Manny Diaz, he told Nate Bauer and explained it, he has a one gap defense. You don't read and react from either defensive tackles or the linebackers. I see more opportunities on film where I'm like, where is the guy that's supposed to be in this gap? And then I see Kobe King kind of playing a situation where he is then kind of playing two gaps, but I don't know that for sure, as opposed to it might have been a defensive mistake, right? So there is a certain aspect of this where I think there may be some coaching differences. And I also think that the team is, the linebackers specifically in this last game, again, I went into the detail of how Penn State's defense rotates and their zone blitzing. They use it as a run technique as well. And so you may think that Tony Rojas is going the wrong way, but that's because that's the way the play is designed. And you can say that's not a good play. And
Right.
I might agree with you. I might agree with like, that's probably at least Penn State has some pretty strong defensive tells. But at the same time, injury or not, Tony has been out of his gap more than he should be. The tackling is the part I say I'm going to give him some passes in terms of his tackling performance after that Bowling Green game, and it's getting better. So I do think that indicates it's probably something injury related. But I'm really looking at those two guys as the two starters in this defense, because Dom DeLuca comes in as a reserve in both that Sam linebacker and that Will linebacker role. They prefer to have a safety or a corner out there. So the top two guys are what I'm evaluating here. And I think they've been okay. Not what I expected. And I know not what Penn State fans expected, but they haven't been as bad, I think, as the opinion about them is so far this year.
Yeah, I think that's fair, T. Frank. All right, let's move on to the safeties, which is headlined by Senior Bowl midseason All-American Jalen Reed. Penn State, of course, lost KJ Winston Jr. earlier in the year to a long-term injury. We'll see if that means he could possibly come back for a playoff stretch or not. Pulled Zachy Wheatley, into a starting role, even though he was a kind of a co-starter. Took Jalen Reed away from that Lion position more often than Tom Allen would like. All told, though, this group is playing at an extremely high level. You went with an A. I went with an A-, frankly, just to be different. A is perfectly acceptable. And so,
I like it.
Yeah.
Let's argue about nuance.
Yeah, I just think that, the minus to me probably just comes from the depth perspective. But we knew that was possibly an issue coming into the year. I think Lane has gotten really sped up. He's come along quickly, but I don't know if he's ready for major, the kind of reps necessary to put Reed into the Lion role more often yet. But certainly he's coming along. And so I think that, the top two of Wheatley and Reed have really done a nice job of overcoming the absence of Winston. It's just, it cannot be overstated how big of a loss that was and is for Penn State. And these guys are helping you to not forget about it, but certainly minimize its impact as much as possible.
I emphasize these things probably more than even the coaching staff or the players will allow for themselves, because they have to have a no excuse policy, which again is this schism of what they tell fans and what the fans then come to expect. And then the honest reality of the situation. Jalen Reed is playing a different position than he started the season at. He was last year not their boundary safety. Now he's a smart player and he has been able to learn all three of the positions from the Lion, that slot corner, nickel, hybrid linebacker position, to the field safety, to the boundary safety. But he's played all three this year. And I find that to be crazy, especially being in kind of an apex role, like a tent pole. You build your defense around certain positions and you've got to have a veteran boundary safety to help in the run game. And he went from everything but that guy to that guy and did it in the course of one game against Bowling Green. So that adaptability, and then the improvement I've seen from Zachy Wheatley. I'd say the area is missed tackles for both of these guys that have cropped up a little bit. Wheatley has really improved in that area and has, in the last two games, I think, been a difference maker against the run that has changed some of my opinion about what the safety group is going to be this year, and does open the door for that long term of getting Dejon Lane on the field once he's mentally ready for that. So it's the context, as you mentioned, of losing KJ Winston and what those players had to do to overcome it that, to me, brings us all together.
Let's wrap up the defense portion of today's BWI Live Show, evaluating each position group at the midway mark of the season with the cornerbacks, T. Frank. Penn State brought A.J. Harris and Jalen Kimber in this year as transfers, even though they returned a number of cornerbacks. Both of those guys have pretty much become starters.
Yeah.
We have the same setup here. I'm an A-, you're an A. I don't really have, again, we're talking percentage points at this moment in time, but I like what this group has done. I thought Zion Tracy was terrific in the USC game and the cornerbacks in general. They had some lapses, but they've been pretty good overall. A.J. Harris has been everything you could have hoped for, and I think, in my opinion, Jalen Kimber may be a little bit more than I anticipated him being. So this cornerbacks room is deep. They're getting Cam Miller and Zion Tracy, some more work in that Lion role when you have Jalen Reed back deep. I think it's just hard to have a lot of complaints about this group at this point of the year.
It's also, as you pointed out, that this group is really taking the brunt of replacing KJ Winston in terms of having another defensive back out there. And I want to give a shout out to Elliot Washington. We talked about him on the show last week, but the versatility that they have within this group now, because you started out the year with Cam Miller playing outside corner. And now I know he played in the nickel, and he was their nickel corner as opposed to the Lion for a good chunk of the, the offseason, preseason, and then early on. But Zion Tracy's been a revelation. And the fact that they have Elliot Washington out there allows them to play A.J. Harris in a more diverse way, put him in the slot on third down, or even just cycle through a couple other guys, and to take Cam Miller full time and put him in the slot. The flexibility of that group is why I have an A. I know that they've given up some plays. I know Cam Miller has not been locked down in coverage, and fans probably have some hard feelings about him going all the way back to their first impression of him during the bowl game, during the Peach Bowl. But I think the way that they have adjusted and adapted and filled that void, to me, that's the impressive part. And they're doing something really hard this year and playing. James Franklin said it kind of downplayed the differences between the man coverage that they played last year and the man coverage they're playing this year. But, respectfully, I see this as a much harder defense for those corners, because last year there a lot of off coverage, a lot of confusing zone looks with the pressure fronts from Manny Diaz. Now it's like, hey, when they play man coverage, there's not a lot of obscurity about it. They sit on the line of scrimmage and say, go ahead and beat us, and teams are not beating them to the level that you would expect, given the turnover at that position with 3 new starters from the corner, outside in the nickel from last year.
No question. All right, T. Frank, we're running low on time here, so we're going to zip through special teams grade. I mean,
yep.
We actually, just full disclosure, we ran out of time and did not put any graphics together for this, so we're free to make it up as we go.
Yep.
Just generally speaking, I would say special teams, I thought James Franklin said it was solid yesterday. That was when he was asked about the return game. I just think in general, solid is probably the way to put it. You're not doing anything super impressive, but he's right in that Penn State has not allowed a punt return yet this year, a yard on a punt return yet this year. And I just think that Riley Thompson maybe not is impactful, or not impactful, but not as pretty, I would say, as last year was. But he's doing fine. All that being said, Gabe Nwusu fine on kickoffs. Ryan Barker, a revelation at field goal kicker now that Sandra Sahedek has been replaced for the second year in a row. And you're just not getting a ton out of the return game, but they're not hurting you either.
Yeah, so special teams can be defense or offense, right? So they can be both. And so I think defensively, this group has been good. As you laid out all those things, it's that fans want offense. They want kick returns. They want punt returns. And neither of those have happened. But again, the defense of not allowing negative yards and negative field position, James Franklin has been pounding the table about how important those hidden yardage plays are. And they've been decent at that this year. And I do think Zion Tracy eventually, if the confidence is there, the athleticism for him to be a Daquan Hardy level player is also in his skill set. It's not Kaden Saunders and Zion Tracy have similar skill sets of elusiveness, lateral cutting ability, explosiveness in those situations. So the potential is there for more. But yeah, I think if you're looking for completeness, and that is a passing grade, there a B minus here.
Yeah, I think that's about fair. I think you're right in that somewhere between B minus and B plus. So I think if you went anywhere in the B column, you'd be okay. All right, final minutes here. Offensive and defensive MVP. Not a whole lot of thought required for these, right, guys? I mean, let's look at the offense. T. Frank and I wanted to be different, so we picked different guys. I picked Tyler Warren, and you picked Drew Aller. Obviously, both of those guys are a big part of the reason Penn State beat USC, but also a big part of the reason Penn State is 6-0. And then on the defensive side of the ball, you went with Jalen Reed. I went with Zane Durant. And it's funny, if you could read our rundown, T. Frank wrote in his comments, it said, if you want to go with Jay Reed, I'll go with Durant. And I said, well, I was going to pick the one that you didn't pick. So we're on the same page there.
Yep.
I'm sure most of you listening were as well. No real surprises there, T. Frank. Those 4 guys, 2 on each side of the ball for us, are the clear-cut leaders of this team.
Yeah, Jalen Reed has done, as we laid out in the conversation about the safeties, he's done something that I think is highly impressive and difficult. Now, being a veteran and being around enough time gives you the ability to do that, of switch positions and know the whole defense inside and out, but it's still hard to execute at that point. So the best player overall in terms of, bulletproof play probably is Durant, has been a little bit better than Jalen Reed, but the level of difficulty there, Jalen Reed doing something I think is really important for this particular team. And I think you can say the same thing about the offense, where Tyler Warren has been by far the team's best player overall. Drew Aller and his growth and maturation and doing something very hard in terms of just playing quarterback at a high level. That's why I picked him of that particular conversation. As you said, we can't just both pick Tyler Warren.
Right. What fun would that be, T. Frank? Well, we are into the final seconds of this Wednesday edition of the BWI Live Show. Don't forget to join us over at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com all week long as you get the latest information from Penn State practice on Tuesday night. We'll have notes about recruiting throughout the rest of the week. Obviously, I'm sure T. Frank and I will both be breaking down the season to date so far. You can join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. There's a special code just for you guys here on the YouTube channel or listening on the podcast. It's PSU1, code PSU1 at sign up. $1 for 2 months of access, so that will take you through pretty much the Lions' run to the playoff. And certainly we hope you'd stick around longer than that. But join us at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com with a subscription using promo code PSU1. It's 2 months for $1. So join us there, PSU1 at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. T. Frank, final thoughts?
Yeah, you're right. We're going to be doing a lot of looking back at the first half of the season. I'm going to write some stuff kind of about the defense and the expectations of what you're getting versus what we're seeing, from a schematic standpoint of not as many turnovers, not as many sacks, diving into that. And then, guys that stand out in the data as far as, midseason standouts from an advanced perspective, not necessarily from a grade or any of the things we did today. So that's what I'm working on this week. And then, of course, Tyler Warren. How awesome is he? We're going to be talking about that.
Sounds good. Well, join us as well at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. Tom Allen and Andy Koldenicki are speaking to reporters if you're listening live. It's about an hour from now. If you're listening on replay, there's a good chance they already have done that, and we'll have a complete coverage of that as those two speak at midseason at BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. So for Thomas Frank Carr, I'm Greg Pickle. So tune in tomorrow for the BWI Recruiting Show with Ryan and Sean. We'll have a BWI Wrestling Show this week as well. And as always, we'll have all the info for you as Penn State exits the bye week and starts the second half of the season. Catch you all next time on the BWI Live Show.